This concept project is about the four main lobes of the brain: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. In this video, I'm going to define each of the lobes and what it does, give an example of each of the lobe's functions, talk briefly on the confusion, and end by talking about the importance of these lobes. First, we are going to begin by talking about the frontal lobe. It is located in the front of the brain and it extends back to the central sulcus. The frontal lobe is the part of the brain that is in charge of reasoning, motor control, emotions, and language. It also includes the motor cortex, which is the planning and coordinating portion of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which allows higher functioning, and lastly it includes the Broca's area, which is the most essential part for language. An example of the frontal lobe with damage is a woman goes into the laundry room to do laundry and gets distracted by the flowers outside. She walks outside and decides they need to be watered and starts watering them. Next, we are going to be talking about the parietal lobe. It is located directly behind the frontal lobe. The lobe is involved in processing information from our body senses. The parietal lobe includes the somatosensory cortex. This processes sensory information across the body. Examples to damaging the parietal lobe include the inability to name an object, problems with reading, drawing, and math, difficulty in distinguishing left to right, and inability to focus visual attention. Third lobe we will be talking about is the temporal lobe. It is located on the side of the head. The name temporal means near the temples. This lobe is associated with hearing, memory, emotion, and some aspects of language. The auditory cortex and Wernicke's area are also part of this lobe. The auditory cortex is responsible for processing auditory language, and the Wernicke's area is important for speech comprehension. Some examples to a damaged temporal lobe can lead to short-term memory loss, interference with long-term memory. Right lobe damage can cause persistent talking, increased aggression and behavior. The fourth and final lobe we are going to talk about is the occipital lobe. It is located in the back of the brain. Occipital means back of the head. The occipital lobe is the vision portion of the brain. It is also the smallest lobe, covering only about 12% of the neurocortex, but it is one of the most important lobes, and we depend on it every day. An example of the occipital lobe would be if you damage your occipital lobe, it can result in complete blindness or partial blindness depending where you damage. Many people get confused about the four lobes of the brain. Why? This topic is confusing because of all the detail and similarity between the four lobes. All of the lobes have different functions, cortexes, and areas, making them difficult to remember which lobe is responsible for which cortex and area. Also, some of the lobes overlap in some of the same basic functions, such as language, making it hard to keep track of each of the lobes and what their functions are. It is also confusing what cortexes and areas are with what lobes and what they contribute to that lobe. For example, the frontal lobe has the motor cortex, the prefrontal cortex, and the Broca's area. Each of these different cortexes and areas do different things that add to what functions the frontal lobe is responsible for. Another confusing part to the four lobes of the brain include where they are located. A way that this can be less confusing is by thinking about the names, and for example, frontal has the location right in the name, front, or temporal, it means near the temples. Why is it important to learn about the four lobes of the brain? This topic holds a lot of importance because it is how you function as a person. These four lobes are what let us speak, understand, see, hear, and even act as a person. If a lobe isn't functioning properly, you could be at risk of losing your vision. If your occipital lobe is negatively affected, you could even lose your memory or hearing if your temporal lobe is affected. These lobes hold a lot more importance to each person than it may seem. It is important for one to know what could happen if any of the lobes are affected and what each of the lobe does. Without knowing any of this, no one realizes how important each lobe is to one.